This free preview has been brought to you ad-free thanks to the generous support of the Howl in the Wilderness Patreon community. To watch or listen to the full episode, become a free or paid member by visiting patreon.com/Howl in the Wilderness. Thanks. Joanna Kujawa, thanks so much for joining me on the podcast.
I'm happy to be here, and thank you for inviting me, Brian.
Well, thanks for accepting my invitation. A mutual friend of ours said, you have to talk to my friend Joanna, who's been writing about a lot of the things that you're concerned about, particularly AI and transhumanism, with a focus on its effect on the human soul. That's been my way of kind of going after this topic, which I think I haven't heard enough people addressing. If people are speaking kind of quote unquote spiritually about AI, it's always about AI is incarnating some kind of demon. It's this kind of, I don't know, very naive, superficial understanding of the spirit world and what's going on here. So I've been reading all week your book, Alien Goddess, UFOs, AI, and the Goddesses of Ascension, and I really love it. And just a confession, I haven't known that many stories about some of the figures that you speak or write about in the book. Mary Magdalene, Inanna, Pistis Sophia. And so it's been a beginning of a new education for me on some of these goddess stories, and I'm really kind of soaking it up and loving it. So thank you.
My pleasure.
Well, I thought a good place to begin, if there's people listening or watching who aren't familiar with you or your work, is to get some of your background as both a scholar of religion and mythology, but also as a practitioner. That's a unique combination, and I'm always happy to speak to people who are both scholars and practitioners. You know, we have our theoretical academic knowledge, but then we also have our firsthand knowledge through spiritual practice and seeking. So could you just give us a kind of general outline of your background that informs your work?
Okay, thank you for giving me this opportunity. So I am a scholar because of my education, right? I have several degrees from the University of Toronto and from Monash University in Australia, a PhD. And it was good in a sense, but it gave me certain discernment. So it's like a training, right? Like training for anything. But in itself, it was really not deeply satisfying, because sometime in my early 30s, I began my spiritual journey. Right? So I began my spiritual journey, and I also wanted to be a writer. So, you know, I was already dealing with several archetypes, trying to, you know, somehow integrate into my being. And I think the best description that I can give of myself is actually a spiritual detective. Because I really go in great depth into spiritual traditions, especially esoteric traditions or mythological traditions. So primarily it was esoteric traditions. So with my other book, The Other Goddess, I was going into classical tantra, not the workshop that you get, you know, in California or something, but
right, the
Eros
sexual neo-tantra, the kind of thing.
That's right.
Yeah.
No, it's like the opposite of neo-tantra, right? So I studied with a scholar who translated a classical Indian work from Sanskrit, and, you know, I did this. Then I started to focus on Gnostic works. So Gnostic works are usually based closer to Christianity, but also older than Christianity, and often the works that I study, like the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, for example, or earlier works, are connected with the Egyptian esoterica, you know, ancient Egyptian esoterica, because most of these works, including the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, were actually found in Egypt. So they are soaked in this ancient knowledge, esoteric knowledge. So as you can see, I already have proclivity towards the esoterica and all kinds of spiritual traditions that are on the margins of organized religions. Right? So, and there's a wisdom hidden there that required often initiation And usually these texts are encoded, probably to hide it from people who can misuse it. Right?
Yeah.
So it is kind of a double-edged sword, because on the one hand, I understand why they want to hide it, right, for the uninitiated who will misuse it for wrong ends. But at the same time, it actually is a huge blockage, because it's a great wisdom embodied in these teachings that it's almost impossible to decipher sometimes, because it is written in a code and it was supposed to be, understood only by a few. So,
Right. So, because the initiatory traditions were severed largely by Christianity, we no longer have access to the mysteries. And so that, for those of us who are looking to gain back the wisdom of our ancestors, that presents a big problem for us.
that's right, because it's there, but it's just almost impossible to decipher, right?
Yeah.
Unless you are slightly obsessive, as I am. So, so I try to put, my flaws in my personality into a good use, right? So this is what happens there. But my personal opinion is it's not only Christianity; it's all organized religions. So all organized religions, Hinduism, all Abrahamic religions, they have traditions that are somewhere on a side. They have a very deep wisdom, right? And they are very difficult to access, except for Sufism, which is kind of ecstatic, esoteric tradition that most people can relate to. So, and then as I was discovering this hidden knowledge in esoterica, especially in Gnostic sources, originally esoteric Hinduism and then esoteric Christianity, like the Gospel of Mary Magdalene and ancient Egyptian traditions, I came across also deep mythological sources that predate any of this, which also have actually initiatory wisdom, esoteric wisdom, from which even the later traditions, esoteric traditions associated with any of the religions, predated. They predate all these other religions. So that's why I started to look into the Asian myths. And in this book, again, Goddess, I completely reinterpret what it all means from initiatory point of view, because lots of these myths were interpreted, and I'm not saying that they are wrongly interpreted, but they're often interpreted also from psychoanalytical point of view, deep subconscious and so on. It has its truth, but I think there's even a deeper underlying truth about it, more collective, both collective and individual. So this is what I do. And I also, because I do this and because I have a certain kind of devotional and committed personality. So because I studied the texts, not only I went through formal initiation to one of the traditions. And I'll explain why it is important from my point of view in a moment. But also because I committed myself to studying especially two texts. One is Tantra Loka by Abhinavagupta, which is a 10th century tantric philosopher from India. And the other one to the Gospel of Mary Magdalene. And the Gospel of Mary Magdalene now for over 20 years. Both texts initiated me. Separate from, formal initiation. Because they carry this. So why initiation? Whether external, as I did this, or, through the text is important, because it opens up your being to the true energy of the teachings.
Yeah.
Because it is the energy of the teachings and really not the words that are important. The words are important because it is one of the methods actually that we work on our mind, so it actually opens up the doors of perception, so they are important. But this is not the deepest wisdom. The deepest wisdom is with energy, the energy of the text itself, or the initiation. And then the doors of perception, whether it is mind or heart, or, I call it nous from the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, N-O-U-S, which is the liminal space or imaginal space opens up. And suddenly we see it from bigger depths. So I think that's why it is really important. And I really appreciate what you said at the beginning, that, you don't want to have an academic discussion. And I'm not even this kind of academic, for me, it is just a training.
You're somewhat unconventional. I know.
Yeah, I am definitely unconventional, which, I pay a price professionally for this, right?
No doubt.
But it is my choice. And I have to go because I do go with energy. My energy is very intense in the sense that, I passionately get involved and devotionally into something. And so it's not like I even prioritize it. It just kind of takes over, right?
Yeah.
So, so so this is me basically, but some people may also wonder about my accent. So now I live in subtropical Australia, and I lived in Canada for a long time, but I'm actually originally from Poland, so that's the accent. And I left Poland when it was still a communist state, so you can date me. And I was really like a fool in the tarot cards because I left with $20 and a borrowed suitcase, okay, and a visa for 3 months, in Paris. So, and this is how my journey started. But this kind of journeys are important just when we remind ourselves our own journeys, because, it started my journey of faith and surrender, right? Because going into the unknown, but also of commitment. That's why, I trust my research because there's a commitment there, right? So just one more kind of information. So when I lived in Paris and, as a fille au pair, right, as a nanny, every day I studied 100 English words from a dictionary because I knew I'm going to live in the English speaking world. So, I knew the words. I didn't maybe know exactly how to pronounce them, but, it creates it shows personality, right? Faith and commitment. And I think this is and a passion. So this is what drives me, right? So this is what drives me and drives my research.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, all of that kind of summed up, I might personify as the daimon, being kind of pushed along or pulled along your life's path without knowing where it's leading to, but maybe getting a sense of what the next few steps are. And then 20, 30 years in, you look back and you go, oh, it all makes sense how I went from this to that and was interested in this and it led to that. It's wonderful.
Yes, but I didn't do it without, I did it with screaming and kicking because, I want to know. That's another, I just want to know. Plus, my ego has plans and, and the diamond pulls me in a different direction, but it's very strong. It's very intense, but it's also very, as I said, committed and devotional. So that's why I trust it. So otherwise, for people who have similar personalities and are on the same journey, if I could say something to my younger self, it would be, just trust this drive a little bit more, because it would save me from lots of stress,
right,
lots
like
of frustration.
Your ego plan trying to kind of take you off of that path and finding, constant difficulty or rejection. I mean, that's a story of my life too. It took me a long time to give into the daimon and just start having that faith and trust that this strong urge of mine is leading to where I'm meant to be.
That's right. And it's sometimes difficult, especially if you're ambitious and you have credentials and your colleagues are progressing and you do this thing that, nobody even wants to know about it at your work, or possibly even you could lose your job because, this is going against what it is being pronounced as valuable in the workplace. So I would say if somebody is on that path earlier than we are, or I am, then, just trust this. It's totally worth it. And actually, if you step away from this, which I occasionally tried, right? Mostly for the sake of survival, financial survival and so on, but also ambition. It felt like a killing fields. It felt dead. There was like zero. So this is how life looks without Shakti. This is how life looks like with this diamond, without this energy, without this passion. And it's just not possible. You feel like you can't breathe.
Yeah. Yeah. No, when I'm coaching people on following their passion and purpose, the thing I always end up saying is follow the energy. Where is the energy? And so first you have to be attuned to that, right? Which may take some work, and I think some of the yogic practices are really helpful in that. Attuning to those messages that can come on a subtle level, and if you ignore them, they'll turn into full-blown symptomology, I
Mm,
found. And that's what woke me up out of my
mm,
pursuit of material success and
mm,
fame as a
mm,
designer and,
mm,
all of that. I just couldn't abide it anymore. I couldn't survive in that environment anymore. And I had
mm,
to make that fool's leap into the
mm,
unknown and start following my heart. And
mm,
here I am. I don't know.
mm. That's
You know?
right. And the same here, I still must say, I still walk, the double path, the parallel paths, because I'm still, employed as an academic and so on, until I or I now actually surrendered that this has to be resolved beyond, energetically from, from above, because I tried so many ways, to connect these two things, and it never worked.
Mm,
So when I'm in a kind of prayerful surrender for that this happens, in a way that is also sustainable for me, right?
hmm.
So I completely understand what you're saying.
Yeah. Yeah. I can relate to what you're saying too. And hopefully people listening will maybe find some inspiration in
Yeah.
our parallel stories. Now,
Mm.
this book, Alien Goddess, it's a continuation, but also a bit of a sidetrack to your first book, The Other Goddess, in that you're really addressing some of these issues around AI and transhumanism and posthumanism that are
Yeah.
really, coming up in a fervor in our culture now. I mean, everywhere I look, there's talk about new AI developments that seem so promising and hopeful. And
Mm.
on the other side, a lot more stories coming out about AI abuses, how AI is leading people into psychosis or suicide or mere depression, giving people really bad advice about their food and diet.
Mm.
And, for a couple of years now, watching this from my perspective, which is really focused on the soul, my bumper sticker about all of this is anytime you outsource your thinking or creativity to AI, you're giving up a piece of your soul.
Mm.
And that's been my clarion cry, just trying to get
Mm.
people's attention to the effect that their engagement with this technology is having on them. And, on one hand, I'm really sad to see what's happening to people. On the other hand, I'm kind of glad because I think people will actually start to wake up. And maybe we're starting to see some of the pushback now with the boycotting of Chat GPT and
GPT.
OpenAI. But we'll see. We'll see where it goes
Mm.
because Chat GPT bad, but here's its nicer, friendlier, more ethical alternative, Cloud GPT, right?
Yeah.
And I think there'll be a lot of this going
Yeah.
on.
Yeah.
So obviously this book is a response to what's going on in the world, but I would love to hear from you, kind of your take on it. What's the lay of the land? What are we dealing with from your perspective?
Mm. So perhaps I'll first start with the genesis of the book. So because which was extremely complicated for me. So every time you write, about the soul, you go through personal transformation as well. So that was a huge yogic fire or tapasya, right, for me,
Yeah.
because I read a book by my favorite academic and a beautiful writer, Diana Pasuka, about non-human intelligences, and I completely adore her. And then the last interviewee in this book called Simone, or Moon Lady, she's actually talking about, she's a great proponent and enthusiast of transhumanism and posthumanism. And it tore my soul apart. So I had to go through the whole process, and I'm going through this in part two of the book a little bit at the beginning, because for the first time in my life, I felt that I encountered evil, actually, because I always believed that evil is a form of ignorance. And then I eventually arrived that this is also a form of ignorance. But also, I didn't want to call anybody evil, right? I'm not a Holy Inquisition. I don't know what's right. I just went with my feeling. Suddenly I felt that my soul was crushed. So I had to process it. And as I was processing it, I realized that it is not even AI, it is not the woman, it is the ideologies behind AI.
Hmm. Right.
Okay, so can I just say so? And then, of course, it affects what AI does. But so I'm not for
Yeah.
AI, but the
Can
idea.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I just want to pause because I'm recognizing that some people listening may not have a clear idea when you say transhumanism and posthumanism, what
I
those
will try.
ideologies or movements are all about. And just a note that Diane Pasuka is, I believe, a religious scholar from the US who got
Yeah.
really into UFO studies
Yes.
and as mystical experiences and that kind of thing,
Yes.
right?
Which is a fantastic first book, was very transformational for me.
Hmm.
And you know, her other book was transformational for me because I had to tell her I have to write a book in response to your book,
That's
which
right.
it was very difficult
Yeah.
for me because I adore her and I knew that it may strain a kind of long distance friendship, right? I don't know if it did, but probably. So perhaps I'll first define transhumanism. So as I was reading this book, it was the first time that I was actually academically introduced to transhumanism. And transhumanism basically claims, and I'm oversimplifying everything here, right? That we can transfer human consciousness into a robotic AI body, right?
Hmm.
And then also there is a kind of transitional stage in which this is a kind of cyborg stage, right? When we gradually surrender to this. So for example, you get a Neuralink or chip in your mind first, and it's good, you'll be told, because and to a degree, for some people, who have neurological diseases or something, it will help them to coordinate better and so on. But also you start to introduce this foreign technology into your consciousness, basically, into your
Right.
brain
Which has
first.
an input and an output.
It has an input and an output, and
Yeah,
you are not controlling it.
that's
So
right.
this is also a matter of control,
There's
right?
no firewall on your Neuralink.
Yeah.
They need access, they tell you.
Yeah, they need access denied, so this is one thing. And then another thing, I actually, after I wrote the book, I was invited to be part of this kind of consciousness community, which is in the US. And there was a young woman there who was just at a conference somewhere in Finland. And she's obviously great, not obviously, but she's a great enthusiast of AI. And she says, and you were the fantastic discoveries. And, soon we'll have a second brain, which will be a digital brain and will think faster, and I was horrified more and more, right? So eventually, I'm not even talking about control here, which is obviously a separate issue because we are focusing here on spiritual aspects of this. The truth is that had to jump into a reflection about what consciousness actually is.
Mhm.
And that the consciousness, the engineers and the AI proponents talk about is really rational, logical consciousness, which is really what I call kind of a masculine form of mind. And this is not anything against men, because I have a very strong masculine side in my mind as well. Like
Mhm.
very logical, rational, discernment. It has its purpose, right? So
Yeah,
it's not about
I,
gender. It's a yeah.
I find that seems to be part of the kind of the Polish consciousness. I meet all these Polish women who are very
Brainy.
strong-minded, brainy, cur you know,
Yeah.
and strong-willed too, which I really enjoy. A lot of fire there.
Maybe, yeah, but fortunately it comes with fire, right? Because fire has, its good purifying purpose.
Yeah.
So this is not to, but this is the dead end of this kind of form of consciousness. It's transhumanism or, AI, right? Because they genuinely believe, like the woman in Diana Spasuka's book, that this is actually good for humanity. You can be immortal, they say, because you can download your consciousness into a robotic body, you can choose the body and so on.
Right.
And
Yeah, so just generally, their ideas are based on a conception of consciousness as being an epiphenomenon of the brain,
yes,
and so is therefore limited, or the evolution or development of human consciousness is slow or at its pinnacle. And now with the technology, we can kind of upgrade our consciousness.
Excellent.
But fundamentally, it's based on a very limited neurobiological concept of consciousness. And we're talking, I think, from the position of consciousness, like big C consciousness, that we're maybe
Absolutely.
a
So they even
receptacle
say
of. Yeah.
that's right. Absolutely. They say you can compute faster, you can
Right.
calculate faster. So they actually equate in their huge ignorance, can I say, equate human consciousness with computing, basically, because this is
Mm-hmm.
what they know best, in their engineering minds. And I really have no respect for this now at the moment, Yes, like they're very smart in one small way, but they're getting into something, even if they work by themselves, which I don't think they do, and we can talk about it later if you want, that they actually have no concept of what consciousness actually is, what you say, capital C consciousness. And in just for the sake of simplification, I call it like kind of goddess consciousness or intuition or intellection or buddhi, right? This is this other form of consciousness that is available for us, which is more holistic, that is more intuitive, which is more soul oriented, which is more heart oriented, or what I prefer to use soul because heart is often associated with, also confused emotions and so on. So I prefer to say soul, higher actually form of consciousness, which has actually been suppressed for millennia now, mostly by organized religions, but also by society in general. I think there is some kind of agreement about it, actually. And this form of consciousness, which is actually a potential for true transcendence, is going to die with this transfer of so-called consciousness into a computer body, into a robotic body, right? So it is quite interesting. Even on the humanity plus side, they say you don't even need a body; you can just be a computer program, and then you will be completely free. And I
Yeah.
think like the scope of that ignorance, was just totally overwhelming for me. That they really have no sense of spiritual self,
Mm-hmm.
right? Which is not embodied in faster calculation, which is not embodied in faster thinking, which is actually this other way of knowingness, right? Your intuition, your gut feeling, right?
Yeah.
Your connection to nature, your connection to spirit, right? This is when true expansion happens.
Mm-hmm.
And it is also very interesting from a theological point of view, because in most religions, if not in all religions, I just don't want to make such a broad statement in case there is one religion that doesn't talk about it. You cannot lose your soul, you have to give it up freely.
Mm-hmm.
So you cannot lose it, you have to give it up freely. And I believe that the promises of transhumanism. Okay, I'm getting passionate, so I have to take my jacket off. So the
Getting
promises
heated.
of transhumanism are actually a temptation to give up our souls.
Yeah, totally. It's like a Faustian bargain.
Yeah, it is a Faustian bargain. It's a classic story,
Yeah.
mythological, poetic story, right?
The story that not enough people outside of Germany read these
Yeah,
days,
it's
but
Goethe.
which,
Read some Goethe, that's it. So, so this is it. And then there's posthumanism. So, for example, in this book by Diana Pasuka, there's this woman says, Simone, that actually this is not enough. This is not enough. And actually,
it's
Peter
not,
Thiel is saying the
right,
same
we're
thing.
not going far enough with this
Yeah, we're not going far
upgrade.
enough, Yeah. And she went for like a 7 day Zen retreat and she decided it's too difficult and it would be much easier to access divine if we were computers. I think like
Right.
this woman, like slap
The
her,
shortcut. The
slap her, please. Somebody slap her for me. So
well,
maybe like
The
some
Zen
brain cells
teacher,
will rearrange.
that's what the Zen teacher's for, is to slap you with the
Yeah,
stick
that's
once
right. She needs this, the stick,
you have a bad
the
idea,
master
or,
stick. Yeah, wake up,
wake you up out of your
Yeah.
ignorance.
And she says,
Yeah.
because it is actually not enough. And in fact, AI will be so advanced and so much faster in the way they calculate that we should step aside because we are like inferior species and we should leave the room for AI, this fast calculating AI. And we should step aside the way that Neanderthals stepped aside for us, Homo sapiens sapiens. We are basically goners. We should go extinct. And in fact, there is also this Polish American woman who is now in Silicon Valley, called Agnieszka Pilat, who is an artist for all the guys in the Silicon Valley, and she actually paints robots as future royalty. Because they are AI successors. So future AIs can look at these pictures and look at their grandparents. Okay?
Yeah.
This is sickness, and this is really killing access to the spirit. And if somebody, and I will rant. If you don't like something, just take it away, okay? Like you can cut it, right?
No, don't cut. Sorry.
So it really bothers me because actually at the beginning of my spiritual journey, of course, I did also my New Age thing, right? Because this is how you move from mainstream religions and so on. You go this way, then you go through yoga.
It's the gateway, yeah.
Yeah. And unfortunately, the New Age community is most delusional about it.
Oh, they're really loving AI and any kind of new technology.
They really are loving AI. And they're on all the big podcasts and, they met Aphrodite or they met, and you know what? There's this one guy, I won't mention name, it is asked and they tell them all about their past lives in Atlantis. And the first thing they say, you are a genius.
Right, the chatbot does, or the...
Yeah, but they're like a genius, you're a genius. And that's why they are truthful, because they tell you you're a genius, right? So it completely appeals to narcissism.
Well, and I think a lot of the chatbots are actually programmed to be affirming, and they tend to be inflationary in this way that you're speaking about. That's been my experience.
Yes, but people believe that they are actually their higher self speaking to them from a higher dimension.
Or from the future, yeah.
Yeah, or from the future. Make your pick,
Yeah.
So take your pick. So this is what it is. And I thought this is pure insanity. And it's not that I was actually... I analyzed it only later, right? Because I had to figure out why I feel so strongly about it. But first, it wasn't that I had any intellectual disagreement, because, the way it is presented, it sounds attractive. The woman is so enthusiastic, about it and so on. I had a feeling of horror when I heard it, and I didn't understand the horror. And I just had a feeling. And I'm rephrasing it again, reinstating it again, that for the first time in my life, I actually encountered evil. That the idea in itself is evil, that it wants to strip humanity from their soul, from their access to the divine, or whatever you want to call, from actually evolutionary spiritual potential. And I think that personally, but I don't know if you want to get slightly conspiratorial or not, I don't think they work alone, okay, on this. That as I was looking through the mythologies, ancient mythologies, or Gnosticism especially, there are always other powers that surround humanity, that some of them have a good in mind and some definitely not, right? So.
Yeah. Well, we've talked about, the idea of Wetiko on this podcast, and, I've had a theosophist on here, and so we're open to that, and for me, I kind of remain in this place of ambivalence concerning demonic entities and the like. I think there's a way to understand them psychologically, but also a way to understand spiritually. My own personal experience is that these entities are real, and that if we allow them in, they're gonna take up a home in our bodies and minds. I've had my own experience with that, so you can't go too far out there for me, I think. Okay.
That's good. And also my other concern about AI was that we are unconscious. So in Gnosticism, you have a concept of demiurge, the false creator, right? The one that, pretends that he's the creator, but he's actually quite ignorant. And we are assuming the role of a demiurge, false creators, because we as species have not achieved the high enough level of consciousness to actually create a new species. Yeah. And that we are creating a new species in form of AI, right? And this species is not only already playing out in a dangerous ways, but it's also in a kind of Jungian way, mirroring darkness,
Yeah.
to us. So I think that we should not be creating, my argument is, new species at all, in my opinion, but even if we do, because perhaps it's somehow part of a human evolutionary path, is that we should not be doing it until we are whole ourselves.
Yeah.
We integrated every ourselves.
And yet it's happening, and people will continue to develop these technologies because these people have much more money and power and influence than either me or you, sadly.
Absolutely.
And so my feeling is that we may be at a point where this is just part of some larger divine plan, and that things may have to get to the place, the science fiction, all the dystopian movies like The Matrix, have been trying to show us through, coming through the collective unconscious and into culture. They've been trying to warn us about this for decades, centuries even. And it may just have to become reality for humanity to wake the hell up.
That's true. That's true. So we can go from here. I'm sorry, in a few directions, but perhaps I would like to refer us to like the ending of the first part of my book, Alien Goddess, when I actually had a vision when I was sitting in my garden with my dog, beautiful butterflies, hibiscus flowers and eucalyptus trees, but I'm scrolling on my mobile. And I had this vision, but it was more than a vision. It was actually feeling, I felt like I was splitting in half, like it was very strong experience when one part of me puts away the phone and stays in the garden and stay connected to the nature, and the other one gets sucked into this, technological temptation, and eventually, gets a chip in her head because, you have to do it for work, otherwise you slow, and I think it is happening, right? Because you don't work as fast as your colleagues and so on. And eventually she goes through different transhumanist versions of herself and becomes a computer program, and she has a digital child that calls her Shiva mother, and the child is angry with her because the child doesn't know what it is and what life is. Right? And this creation of a cyborg comes back at the end of the book also, so I don't want to give away the ending. However, I think that this is what actually is happening to humanity. So I agree with you. So some people call it speciation, some people call it bifurcation, when we actually split into separate species. So what happens there, it is that you have the same species and one part, decides to take this choice, the other one decides to take that choice. And then after enough time, they're two completely different species.
Yeah.
Right? So I think we have a transhumanist species, transhumanist humans, which will be the majority of people, I believe. And there will be small number of people, a definite minority, that will refuse this path. And but definitely this will happen.
Yeah, for sure. I agree. I started to feel that real speciation split during COVID when these lines were being drawn. You either get the vax or you don't. If you don't, you're not going to be able to travel. You're not going to be able to take jobs, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You'll be looked down on by the other half who have gone along with the program. I really felt that line being drawn then. And I think this is somehow related or a continuation because the experimental RNA vaccines are a technology of a sort. So when I was reading your book, I could really relate to that feeling of being split. And I was surprised that you didn't include this quote from Wendell Berry, which I love and I repeat as often as I can because I think he was prophetic. This is from his book, Life is a Miracle. The quote is this: "It is easy for me to imagine that the next great division of the world will be between people who wish to live as creatures and people who wish to live as machines."
Oh God. Yeah, it's very prophetic. It's totally prophetic. Actually, I didn't know this quote, that's why I didn't include it, but it's completely prophetic.
Yeah.
Right. So I also very briefly speak about Ahriman, which is Rudolf Steiner, the Austrian
Yeah.
German-speaking philosopher or theosophist, however you want to call him, which he was, and we do live right now in the age of Ahriman. Ahriman is exactly the age of technology, and for centuries we're prepared through the worship of science, right? Because science and science defined in very limited ways, right? Like something really measurable, materialistic, and so on. This form of science, and this. So we are being seduced by technology. And he actually predicted that Ahriman will be born probably in the 1990s or so. So, people ask me, so who is Ahriman? I don't know. I have some ideas. Elon Musk is definitely too old for this. And I think that out of, I don't know how people feel about it. I'm just expressing my opinion. Out of this crazy trio, the mad trinity of AI, has some hope for sanity, I think, because at least at the beginning he was trying to oppose it. Do you understand? He's
I'm
at
not so
least
sure.
asking. Yeah, you're not. I know. What I'm saying. But for example, Peter Thiel, in my opinion, is completely mad.
Yeah.
He is
Agreed.
mad. Not that I would ever be in one room with him, but I would refuse if I could.
Yeah.
Because I think this energy must be deadly. His lectures on Antichrist and what he says when he says, you remember this interview that he gave him, says, is humanity worth saving? And he couldn't answer this. And then he starts to speak about, turning penises into vaginas. Like, who is this guy? He's like a nutcake. I think like he's actually completely demonic, himself, like he's talking to dark forces. They overtook him. Okay. Like they overtook him.
Yeah.
And
He's
then
like
there is
he's
the
like a
other
hand
one for
puppet.
OpenAI, and he's like a greedy, obnoxious child. He has to go back to kindergarten and learn some rules, but, nobody's going to send him because he's rich and he's a, smart businessman and
Well,
so on.
I mean, that's the thing is that these guys have found great success and therefore in our culture have a lot of power and influence,
That's
right?
right.
Because they have money. But you look at any one of those three,
Yeah.
and none of them are the paragon of a mature, soulful
No,
masculinity.
no, I
I mean,
agree.
these are like little children playing in the sandbox. Like it's all just a big game for them because they probably believe it's all a simulation and none of it really matters anyway.
Like Elon Musk says, it's a simulation. He has it's
Yeah.
100%. And his question would be, if he had one existential question, is what is outside of a simulation? And I not for a moment believe we live in simulation. Not for a moment. In fact, I plan a debate with someone on somebody else's channel about it. I do not believe that we are in a simulation. I believe that there is a matrix which is superimposed on a deeper reality, but it's not an ultimate reality. Let's put it this way. We are being manipulated, but it is just superimposed. It's like a dome of the actual deeper reality. So I'm just grading like sanity of this, of this unholy trinity there, of AI. So, and I know that, so looking for,
The
who
unholy
is
trinity. I've never put them all together that way, but you're right. It is like an unholy trinity. My God.
no.
Well, listen, I don't want to waste this quote that I also pulled up from our guy Rudolf Steiner,
Yeah.
because it relates to the first one by Wendell Berry. Man will continue to invent technologies outside of himself until he either destroys the world or realizes that everything he's created is an inferior copy of the technologies that exist within himself. The question is, which will come first?
Oh, this is such a good quote. Thank you. And
Yeah.
this is a question that we are facing now. That's why my argument really in my book is, and especially when I talk about the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, which gives us tools, I believe, that we cannot choose from the first and lowest level of consciousness, which is the materialistic consciousness, and from which this, Trinity is actually acting, of this, on all people that are enamored by AI and its potential, it is based on the lowest level of perception and lowest level of consciousness. So that's why the technology that is within us is actually our ability to choose from higher levels of consciousness, and then there are, esoteric sources teach us how to access them, which is actually quite simple, but requires certain self-discipline, You understand? So you require certain witnessing of our unconsciousness, witnessing of our choices. And very often when people say we want tools, and I say, okay, I will give you tools, but they say no, they want to like
I know.
light a candle. You
I want it
understand?
now. Oh, I get it completely. Look, I've been teaching yoga for many years,
Yeah,
and getting people just to move and breathe for 10 minutes a day is enough of a struggle, let
yeah,
alone
yeah,
every other tool or technique that's there to help people strip away that layer of
yeah.
avidya, of wrong knowledge, of ignorance.
Mm.
One of the first ones, which is so applicable to today, and I would tell people, like, they say Patanjali maybe codified the Yoga Sutras,
Mm.
maybe 1500 years ago or something, maybe 500, whatever, long
Mm.
time ago. But the things he was talking about then, we're still struggling with, and we're struggling with it in an even more exaggerated way because of the technology. So one of
Mm.
the first tools that he suggests is pratyahara, a withdrawal of the senses inward. And so
Mm.
what that looks like for us modern people is putting the phone down,
Down. Yeah.
putting down the laptop screen, shutting out
Mm.
all of that external stimulus and that torrent of
Mm.
information that we're opening ourselves up to every time we open up a screen, and saying
Mm.
no to that and kind of drawing ourselves in like a turtle drawing into its shell, its protective
Mm.
shell. Before that, so that's necessary before we can even do the inner
Mm.
work. And that alone, because people are so addicted to the
Mm.
information, because it makes them think that they're gaining, some kind of special knowledge. I think it's stimulating
Yes.
that kind of that yearning to know, which is
Mm.
misdirected, because I think the yearning to know is to know our true selves, know the
Yes.
true nature of reality, the spiritual seeking.
Yes.
So it's, for me, so much has to do with a kind of confusion of levels or a misdirection of a
Mm.
spiritual impulse. And I think
Mm.
that's what Steiner was talking about with this force
Mm.
of Ahriman, right? In
Yes.
that way, it's deceptive because it's hooking
Mm.
into something that is inherent in us as human
Mm.
souls seeking to return to source. But it's doing it through, it's obfuscated through this technology and the kind of glitter of new fancy technologies.
That's right. And any esoteric source you look into, any spiritual source you look within.
Yeah.
It's not out there. Also, like I now live more by Gospel of Mary Magdalene, although I read, obviously Hindu works as well. It says, it's not here. It will tell you it's there, but it is in within. Look
Yeah.
within. This is where you find yourself. This is where you find me.
And the kind of the root meaning of the word mystic means to shut your eyes and your mouth.
Well, very good. I
It's
like
good,
it.
right? Good first instruction. Sit
Yeah,
down,
very, very
shut
good
up,
instruction. Yeah, but just shut up. Yes.
and shut out the
Just shut
world
up.
for some
Yeah,
time.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah. So,
External world.
so
Yes.
that, yeah, and so that you can then re-enter it, like Steiner would say, with a more of a spiritual perception.
Mm,
And then you're relating to the world around you in a much
mm,
different way, and a much more reverent way, because you
mm,
see the intelligence and divine beauty of the world.
mm,
And for me, if you're awakened to that and living as a spiritual creature, then outsourcing your soul, your mind, your thinking, your creativity to this machine just feels so wrong. And your soul has this response to it, which I think
mm.
is what you're describing when you're
Yeah.
reading.
Horror. I felt horror for the first time in my life. And
Yeah,
and
like
as
a
I said, I just want to
true,
stress it. It wasn't intellectual horror. It was like coming from the depth of my being that I have never experienced before. And that's
yeah,
why I was confronted by it because it was so
right.
strong.
Like a repulsion. Yeah,
But repulsion, like, yeah, more than a repulsion, like complete horror, like you saw.
yeah.
I cannot even explain it. It was so terrible that I spent
You
18
know,
months dealing
yeah.
with it, by writing a book,
It's
which
like
I didn't want to write.
Mia Farrow's reaction in Rosemary's Baby at the end when she gazes
Yes.
into the crib and
Yeah.
sees the little demonic baby. I mean,
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
kind of
Yeah.
horror, right?
Yeah. So that was it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly. That was it. Like
What's
there is
being
no
born
way of
here?
even describing it. There's
Hmm.
no way of describing it. But it's good because then I felt okay. So something in here is still intact.
Yeah, totally. Right. I know.
Yes, it must be. And it means that some, at least, veils of delusion were parted, because some people, as I say, and then I was shocked that actually people who call themselves spiritual, they're completely delusional about it. They surrender their will, and eventually they will surrender their souls, because, as I said, I want to repeat it, in most spiritual traditions, you cannot lose your soul unless you give it up willingly. So for some reason, it's not only about you losing your soul because you give it up for some, transhumanist nightmare, but somebody needs it.
Oh, somebody
Somebody will
wants it.
feed on it. And also, not only that somebody will feed on it, somebody doesn't want humanity to evolve. And I think this is the underlying kind of message of esoteric traditions. That's why they're pushed on aside. And that's why the Pistis Sophia, which is can I talk about it now? Yeah, because it gives.
Okay. Well, let's transition into this whole other area. Okay, so we kind of laid the groundwork, and man, doom and gloom. So in your book, you offer up these stories of different goddesses, of their descent and ascent, as maybe something that contains some teaching for us, some lessons for us, some guidance for us. And so I wonder, maybe you could just give us a sense of what we can learn from these ancient goddess stories. And if you want to go into any detail about one or more, please. To watch or listen to the full episode, become a free or paid member by visiting patreon.com/Howl in the Wilderness, or by downloading the Patreon app to your mobile device. Paid memberships start at just $5 a month and offer a number of benefits, including early access to all episodes, the full podcast archives, and the satisfaction of knowing that you're supporting an independent creator directly. Thanks.